research seminar series for MSDI. I'm really glad that we can host Professor Simon Joss from Glasgow University. Simon is on a trip in Australia, spent much of the last week in Sydney, where he's doing some collaboration with the University of Sydney. And I was lucky enough to have Simon come over here as well. So that's great. So Simon is a professor, he's a social and political scientist with a long history of doing research and engagement in the area of urban development, sustainable urban development, as well as smart city development. So this is actually how we got to know each other. We collaborated in a project some years ago, which was around smart eco-cities in China. And we share sort of an interest in understanding the transition or transformational dynamics in that from a social and political perspective. I think Simon is also, what's also really interesting about your profile is that you only fairly recently moved to the University of Glasgow. Before that you were at the University of Westminster in London. But in Glasgow you are also Director of Policy Engagement at the Urban Big Data Centre. And obviously that is another important link to some of the work that's going on at the university level, where the University of Monash has positioned itself also in this big data AI space quite substantially over the last couple of years. So this morning we had a really good conversation with Elizabeth Croft, for instance, from the Dean of Engineering, not necessarily about the big data stuff, but more around the establishment of a possible Monash Cities Institute at the university. So today, Simon, you will talk about a specific paper which actually came out of the project that we did together, and I'm happy to say that also one of your co-authors is a former PhD student of myself. I think it's a really good piece of work. I read it, and I know how much time it took to write it. At least 2 or 3 years have gone into getting it together. So it's a really good piece of work, and I'm really interested to hear about the way you talk about this.
Thank you very much, Rob, and very good afternoon. And thank you very much for hosting me here at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. The first time I visited Melbourne was 23 years ago when I was a PhD student, so it's happy returns for me. So thank you very much for joining me this afternoon for this paper on smart cities. Now, Rob mentioned that I'm the chair of Urban Futures at the University of Glasgow and also Deputy Director of the Urban Big Data Centre. And inevitably one encounters the smart city which shapes normatively how we think about the future of urban development, and it also shapes the practice of particularly how big data is applied in urban governance and planning. So today I'm going to talk about the smart city and about a particular project which, as Rob mentioned, we'd been working on for about the best of 3 years. At times it was really hard work. And in that project we were interested in developing a horizon scan of current smart city developments, and I'll be explaining the particular approach that we chose. And one of the particular interests we were trying to develop was the relationship between smart cities, smart urbanism, and sustainable urbanism. So that's going to be the focus of my presentation, I think suitably so, given that I'm hosted here by the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And so chiefly what I want to do this afternoon is to, first of all, make a point that arguably the smart city has become the urban paradigm. And I'm going to present some evidence pointing to that. And secondly then to discuss the implications of that, particularly the implications for sustainable development. And one way of understanding the smart city phenomenon is to suggest that perhaps important sustainability concerns are being edged out by this burgeoning concept of the smart city. That's one way of interpreting it, and again I hope to be able to present some evidence to that effect. But you can also interpret the smart city phenomenon slightly differently by saying, well, it does actually still engage with sustainable development, but it reframes questions about sustainability in certain ways. So, as I said, I'm going to report on a project, I'm going to provide some evidence, and what I really hope is that we can open up a conversation afterwards about what we are to make of this smart city phenomenon. And I guess perhaps what we can put in the room as well is a question about, should we really embrace the smart city? Does it provide us the technological means by which we can finally scale up sustainability efforts? Or perhaps should we be concerned about what is being left out through the smart turn? And I want to now engage with the first point about the evidence that really the smart city is the latest talk and the latest show in town. The smart city literature began to mushroom, began to grow from circa 2008 onwards. And in the early 2010s, people started to notice that it was becoming a really important paradigm in urbanism. And sort of by 2012, 13, 14, people started to say that perhaps it's going to become a dominant, if not the dominant paradigm. And this is, for example, illustrated by this quote here from a paper published in 2014 by Moyer et al., where the author suggests that sustainability is no longer the main prism through which thinking about the future of cities takes place. Smart cities has become the most popular formulation for the future city, and it's becoming a globally recognized term. And it was around that time that I was involved in a project with several Dutch colleagues, led by my colleague Martin de Jong, and we were interested in looking at the literature, the academic literature, and to see how that smart city concept, as well as other main key urban concepts, evolved across time. And this is one of the figures that we produced in that paper published in 2015. Now, I'm not going to engage with some of the other concepts we were interested in, such as resilient city and low carbon city. I want to focus my commentary on the smart city in relation to the sustainable city. And what you can see from this bibliometric analysis of some 1,400 academic articles scooped up through Scopus, what you can see is that across time the sustainable city was by then the most dominant urban paradigm as measured by the number of academic articles. And we know why, because sustainable city, sustainable urban development became an accepted policy paradigm starting in 1987 with the Brundtland Report, and then internationally established from 1992, the Rio Conference onward, Habitat 1, Habitat 2, and Habitat 3. So cumulatively, by 2013, when we were doing this bibliometric analysis, the sustainable city was the most written about urban paradigm or concept at the time. But what we did notice was that from about 2008 onwards, suddenly the smart city was starting to take off. And certainly looking at 2013, we saw that, oh, that's interesting, what's happening here? So we published this paper, it got relatively high citations, and people have, in the meantime, prompted us to say, well, are you going to do a follow-up study? And currently we're in the process of doing this follow-up study, which hopefully we'll be able to submit early next year. And so the next figure I'm going to show is basically an extension of this scale to 2018. So again, consider here the sustainable city and then the smart city, and this is what happens. Now this is unpublished, so I'm going to show it only shortly. But that's what's been happening in exactly the same methodology using Scopus. And here, basically, that's the point that we were looking at here, 2013. And what we see is a massive increase in academic publications around the smart city. Note, though, that the sustainable city is still growing. There's a little bit of an increase here, probably related to the SDGs and the Habitat 3 conference. But nonetheless, some evidence within the academic literature that something is afoot here, that perhaps the smart city is becoming a dominant paradigm addressing urban transformation. But we shouldn't only look to the academic literature, we can also look to policy, the world of policy, where we can see the smart city being embraced by governments around the world. And I've listed here 3 examples of smart city initiatives. And these are not trivial initiatives. Some of them are very substantive, such as the Smart City mission in India, which extends to over 100 cities, and which really reshaped the way that urban planning is practiced within the Indian context. Interesting, for example, to note here the particular packaging of the smart city in the European context, first of all with an emphasis on growth, the growing of cities, and also the weaving of smart and sustainable together. So in the policy world too, we can see the smart city really becoming a important paradigm. And this is where we've come in as a research team, and we've been interested in trying to develop a global overview of that phenomenon. And what we were trying to do is not restrict our analysis to the academic literature, but we were particularly interested in seeing how the smart city relates to actual cities. And in this project, which was headed the Smart City as a Global Discourse, we posed three main research questions. So which cities worldwide are mainly associated with contemporary smart city discourses? Methodological caveat here, we're restricting the analysis to the English language. We can open up a discussion afterwards about some of the methodological restrictions and limitations. Secondly, then, once we've identified this network of cities around which smart city discourse has evolved, what are the key dimensions of this discourse and how do they interrelate? And thirdly, how are particular narratives mobilized to legitimize the smart city, and what critical junctures reveal themselves? So I've already mentioned half a dozen times discourse, so let me just very briefly explain our conceptual approach. We very much see discourse as an integral part of social practice. So it's not distinct, it's not separated from social practices, but discourse is an integral part, is part and parcel of the practice of the smart city. And so we talk about the smart city's materiality existing in close relationship with its discourse, and the smart city's local grounding existing in close relationship with its global circulation. This is our overall conceptual approach. So we're saying that by doing a discourse analysis, it gives us an interesting window into what the smart city is conceived of and how it's treated differently across different cities. We very much, using critical discourse analysis, want to identify the salient discourse regime. We follow here Kitchen in particular, which, who defines the discourse regime as a set of interlocking discourses that justifies and sustains new developments, here the smart city, and naturalizes and reproduces their use. And so it's important when doing critical discourse analysis to note that actually we're dealing here with discourse deployed on purpose to remake the world in a particular vision. So the discourse allows us to see how the smart city is propositioned as a new way of thinking about the city. And of course we want to take a critical analytical stance on that to try to understand what is being constructed. You then bring this down to the textual level, and here we're particularly interested in identifying storylines and narratives, often competing storylines and narratives, through which the smart city is presented and also represented. Now, just one slide on methodology, but Rob indicated that it was quite a lengthy project. We had a 3-year funding, and this project was going to be the first 6 months as a sort of a horizon scan, preparatory work to inform the choice of individual case studies on the ground. And we ended up, actually, that was one of the last papers produced because it turned out to be methodologically so fiendishly difficult. So we took a webometric approach to try to get at that global discourse. And I guess what is arguably quite innovative is that we linked the global webometric discourse to actual cities. So the first, sorry, I need to move back here in order for the mic to capture my voice. First of all, what we had to do is to establish a comprehensive list of cities. And we were actually quite surprised that we couldn't just open a drawer and get that list. We couldn't just ring up the UN and say, can you please give us a comprehensive list of cities of 100,000 inhabitants and above. But it took us quite a while to compile this, and methodologically it gets quite difficult and challenging. For example, if you have a city like Köln, Colonia, you need to make sure that both are captured in order to truly be able to trawl the web. So that took us a while to put together a comprehensive list of 5,558 cities worldwide. These are all cities, we believe, across the world with 100,000 inhabitants or above. And then we linked that to an online search. We used Yahoo. Again, you partly have to draw on existing literature on webometrics, but we also had to do a lot of testing on actually what works and what doesn't quite work. We eventually settled for Yahoo because it allows us to select, for example, for PDF documents, which other sources such as Google and Bing wouldn't have been able to do. And we searched for the city name and smart city. So you then end up with a very long list, 5,558 cities, and against each you have a count of hits, of how many times smart city is mentioned in connection with individual city names. Now, obviously, we couldn't analyze all 5,500 and plus cities. We had to cut it down to a sizable, manageable size, and we ended up identifying 27 cities at the heart of this global discourse network. This process involves quite complicated validation processes. And from these 27, so that's in a sense the census we carried out. It's almost like carrying out a census online of the implications of smart city discourse related to individual cities. We identified 27 cities at the heart of that global discourse network, and the next slide will show you what these 27 cities are. And from these 27 cities, we assembled a corpus of 346 PDF documents. So that is the overall corpus, which we then subjected to both quantitative and qualitative analysis. Quantitative analysis, as I'll show the result in a moment, which measures the co-occurrence of terms with smart or smart city, and the concordance analysis, which allowed us to dig a little bit deeper and provide a more qualitative, interpretive picture of that discourse. So, these are the 27 cities which, based on our methodology, we say are at the center of that global discourse network, which is not to say that other cities aren't part of the wider extended network, because of course we made a selection at some point. We made a cut-off where we decided that we were only going to include cities where there were more than 2,500 hits against them. You'll find here Melbourne sort of halfway down with 3,010 hits, from which, in the case of Melbourne, we collected 8 documents. Basically, for each city, we looked at the first 20 PDFs, and we had to run a number of checks. So sometimes you had a duplication of PDFs, in which case you then drop them out, and that gives you a total of 346 cities, PDF documents. Now, what is quite striking as well is that of these 27 cities, 13 are capital cities and 21 are alpha cities, which suggests a close correlation between the status capital or world city and the centrality of smart. So what we find is that it's predominantly capital and world cities at the center of the smart city discourse, and that often these capital cities or world cities are positioned as being lighthouse cities that would demonstrate smart city capability, which could then be emulated by lesser cities, second and third tier cities, so-called follow cities. And so there's an interesting correlation between smart being synonymous with world leading. And this is illustrated by these 2 quotes here. Just to give you an example of how that global city focus is woven in with the smart city discourse. So the first one, we'd have the example from London, leverage London's global city role, working with other EU countries. At the time, Britain was still working with EU countries. That's changing now. And global cities, such as New York and so on, to share experience and develop lighthouse projects. But at the same time, what you can also find in this example from Amsterdam, that they are referring to these leading cities, which will then inspire smaller communities, this is in a European context, such as Friedrichshafen, Aarhus, Santander, and so on, to engage in that smart city discourse. So that's the network of 27 cities. And as I said, we assembled a corpus of 346 documents from across these 26 cities. And what we deployed using a software, Anticonc, it's a freeware, what we used is a so-called distance reading technique. So we didn't download the individual documents and read them closely, but we read across the 346 documents, across the 1.3 million words, across the 27 cities in order to identify key trends, key dimensions of the smart city. So that was part of a quantitative analysis, and what we did was to measure 20 words both to the left and to the right of smart city. And by capturing these 20 words, so 40 words around smart city, you get a sense of how the smart city is defined. We did this quantitatively. You get a frequency list. We included the first 100 most frequent terms, and then used a categorization by identifying some 12 key smart city dimensions in order to develop a more quantitative picture. And that's the result of that. So that's taking 100 most frequently associated terms with smart city and trying to quantify them by assigning a particular smart city category to them. What I want to point out here at the lower end, significant for us, given the topic of this seminar, is that both the environment and sustainability dimensions were actually quite weak compared with some of the other dimensions, making up only 2.8% combined, which came as a surprise to us. Because this suggests that the environmental and sustainability component, as measured quantitatively, is actually quite weak within the smart city context. Also notable that governance is to the fore, so one would perhaps think that the digital technology component would be the most dominant one, but on a quantitative basis, governance was to the fore, which signals that the smart city is very much discussed in relation to the management of cities, planning and governance processes. Also noting what I've already highlighted, that actually the international component is quite significant. So the smart city is very much defined through its international dimension. So that was the quantitative part of our analysis of the 346 documents. And then we, as I mentioned, also wanted to do an in-depth qualitative analysis. And that's the so-called concordance analysis. And what you do for each of the 12 dimensions that I've just shown, you look at individual color codes. In this case, what you can see is public, and we call up each instance across the 346 documents where public is mentioned, and we can read the context within which public is mentioned, and that affords us a qualitative insight into the various dimensions. And from that qualitative analysis, we identified what we term 5 critical junctures, 5 key narratives or counter-narratives, where we think, in a sense, the interesting boundary work of the smart city is currently taking place. I obviously want to end up by focusing on smart and sustainable as one of the key junctures, but I'm starting to relatively swiftly go through the other ones as well, because they are quite important in shaping what the smart city discourse is all about. So the first point, or the first critical juncture we observed, is that what we call the socio-technical bifurcation, by which we mean that the smart city on one hand is defined in terms of its technological focus, but on the other hand it also tries to define it in relation to its social usability and social focus. And that is often unresolved tension. It, on one hand, wants to be all about technology, but also wants to be people-oriented or public-focused. So here you've got one example from Vancouver, which perhaps is a more traditional way of defining the smart city, which defines it in terms of basically being about using technology. And then the second example you have from Amsterdam provides something of a counter-narrative. And here you get the impression that Amsterdam is really styling its smart city approach first and foremost as a proposition for collaboration, for networking, for stakeholder engagement. And they're blatantly saying, you know, no matter how much ICT, you know, it's essentially about the starting point is about collaboration. It's not about technological solution. So here we can see a narrative which tries to distance itself from what perhaps is perceived to be the more dominant, certainly historically more dominant narrative about a technology-led smart city. Another interesting tension that we identified was whether or not the smart city is essentially about transformative change, an entirely new way of thinking, as one document puts it, or whether it's more soberly about incremental optimization. The repeated mention of the excited transformative potential of the smart city. The smart city is so different, in essence, to the 20th century city that the governance models and organizational frameworks themselves must evolve. The smart city approach might fundamentally transform the way cities are governed. Here, an example from Melbourne. But then a much more sober approach, much more down to earth approach, saying, well, actually, the smart city, it's about providing better management and planning, it's improving existing building management to create more efficient approaches to energy management, and so forth. So on and so forth. And, you know, how are we to interpret this? And perhaps one way of seeing it is that the smart city speaks both into the future, projecting to a more long-term vision, 2050, 2000, whilst at the same time also speaking to current concerns and current processes. How am I doing for time? Let me just check. Right, I need to move on a little bit because we want to have enough time for discussion. So the next critical juncture that we identified is that whether or not it's a place, a project, a phase. And what we were struck by was how frequently the smart city was equated with experiment, incubator, test, pilot, and so on. And what is quite difficult to discern is how this lands within the urban context. So there's some tension here, defining the smart city almost as if it's a project or an organization, but then evidently, you know, having difficulty how this lands within the city context and how also that can be scaled up. A further critical juncture that we identified is that, and note here that I'm not calling it public-private partnership, but private-public partnership. On one hand, the smart city discourse is littered with reference to being citizen-centered, people-oriented. It's all about benefiting the public and so on. But then looking more closely, the discourse is framed in terms of the market, in terms of private interests. And insofar as the public is invited to be part of the smart city, it is invited to almost act as a private individual, as a private participant. Which brings me to the final juncture, the one that I want to expand a little bit, and I'll spend the remaining 5 minutes of my talk just homing in a little bit more on that tension between smart and sustainable. And just to remind you here, based on the quantitative analysis, the environment and sustainability dimensions combined only made up 2.8%, which came as something of a surprise to us. And looking at how environment and sustainable as adjectives and nouns are used within the text, often it will be seemingly just a generic, used as a generic descriptor for good urban development without further explanation. And you can interpret this in two ways. One way is that by now sustainable environment and environmental is so accepted, and people will know, urban planners will know what you mean if you mention sustainable, that it doesn't require any further explication. Or more pessimistically, you might argue that it's a little bit tokenistic. You just throw sustainable and environmental in to be able to sell the smart city. Having noted this overall result, nonetheless, it's interesting to see that if you look at individual corpora relating to individual cities, you see some differences. And these are the three cities that have a most pronounced environmental and sustainable dimension: Vancouver, Copenhagen, and Vienna. To give you here the example of Smart Vienna, which deliberately creates a very explicit relationship to sustainability. So the smart city is defined in terms of sustainability, as you can see from this quote. I'll read it out. Smart City Vienna promotes the development of a city which is based on sustainability and the protection of resources through three key strategies: a vision of a sustainable future for Vienna in 2050, a roadmap for energy efficient and climate-friendly urban development up to 2020, and so on. Smart City Vienna has developed a concept which provides vision for the city's future. So let's now dig a little bit deeper at precisely how the environmental and sustainable dimensions are framed. And what is quite characteristic is that the environmental and sustainability dimensions are discussed largely in relation to climate and energy-related aspects. And that perhaps is not entirely surprising, because the ascendancy of the smart city as a paradigm has gone in parallel with global climate change concern of this reaching a global platform. So here we see two examples, two quotes, which bring in that carbon emissions and global climate change dimension into the equation. And looking here at the second example from Vienna, smart city is leveraged in by providing smart technologies to enable that transition to a CO-friendly net carbon development. So that technology focus is quite prominent, and the example here from Hong Kong underlines this. In view of ever-changing environment and global climate change, cities around the world are looking for the use of ICT to increase the resilience of their systems and to enable cities to adapt. So the smart cities promise is that through the application of ICT we can meet all sorts of environmental and sustainability challenges. And that fits into a wider ecological modernization narrative where the smart city really affords an improved innovation process, which in turn then improves and supports growth and the global economy. So a strong ecological modernization framing. The last slide I'm going to show is what we haven't found in that discourse. And discourse analysis prompts you to think about what is excluded from the discourse. So not just focus what's there, but also what's not there. That in itself can speak volumes. And I've done just a little bit of a check against SDG 11, and these are key rubrics, key aspects, how the SDG process defines sustainability, environmental aspects, and these are largely or mostly absent from the documents that we found. So what we do find is that, yes, sustainability and environmental aspects are being discussed through the smart city, but they're discussed through particular thematic foci, whilst being relatively silent on a number of what otherwise would be recognized as important sustainability dimensions, which leads us to conclude in the paper that evidently then the smart city does strive for sustainability, but the particular approach pursued may well end up casting important environmental and other sustainability concerns aside. And on this note, I'd like to end my talk and open up the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. All right, great talk, Simon, and I'll open up the floor for questions, comments, and discussion.
Maybe a methodological question.
So you got to use the speaker because we got the microphone got a few people on Zoom as well.
All right. Yeah, so Liton Kamrujaman from MADA. So this is a little bit of methodological question first, and then I will do some comments. So you said you reviewed 27 cities and 346 PDFs.
Yeah.
So are those PDFs academic documents or city policy documents?
Right. They're a mixture. We deliberately decided not to use a bibliometric approach because that would have yielded only academic text. We went for webometrics, so it borrows from bibliometric methodology but applies it to the web. And just as a footnote there, in contrast to bibliometric analysis where the environment is inherently stable, you use indexed databases, the web is inherently unstable, so you have to really adjust your methodology to correct and to make it robust enough to collect information. But what you get by doing a webometric analysis is, in our case, for PDFs, they can be published from an industry, can be published from city administrations. So academic articles are not there, or a minority of them. They are typically from research organizations that might have published a national policy document on the opportunities for smart cities. It might be city administrations themselves publishing a strategy on smart city. We have NGO documents engaging with the smart city discourse critically or otherwise. And this is precisely why we chose the webometric approach, however methodologically difficult it is, precisely in order to get at that wider discourse on the smart city. So it is not an academic discourse that we're analyzing, but we would call it a wider policy, practice, public discourse.
Okay, yeah. And the second point is we are studying here about the relationship between smart cities and sustainability in a quantitative manner. For example, we investigated 15 smart cities in the UK over the last 10 years, 15 years, how the particularly internet access has evolved there and how that relates to the carbon emission.
Right.
And we found that access to internet and carbon emission is not related. So smart cities basically are not the sustainable cities. So I'm telling that because probably your talk partly explain why that is the case. Yeah. And very insightful talk, Simon. Yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd be really interested to learn more about your project of did you say 15 cities in the UK?
Yeah.
All right, because we've done in another project, the cities of an analysis, comparative analysis of 6 smart cities in the UK. So maybe after the talk we should compare notes.
Yes.
Tony, you had a question as well?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Simon. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm intrigued by, from the outset, in terms of the framings of cities. I think you had maybe a list of 12 or 15 from eco-city to sustainable and smart, that there was no mention of healthy cities coming through. And in my field of health and medicine, there is a discourse of healthy cities, but it's interesting to see that it doesn't emerge through this sort of analysis. And a second sort of related, more specific question is whether human health emerges in the context of the smart city discourse specifically, or if it seems to be absent there as well.
Yeah. So I have to hold my arms up because, and by the way, the data is all available online. So we published the data set, the underlying data set. So if you'd like to dip into it and have a look at it, there is reference to health. So I think the health theme, it was under the society dimension. But you know, you've only got about 8,000 words to write in one article and so on. So I think we could probably go back and look a little bit more deeply. So I remember from the analysis that actually it is there as a theme and we categorize it under society. But It's less about, in a sense, the human health, and less about, in a sense, a concern for individuals and communities. And it was more, as I recall it, about making the healthcare provision more efficient. So it was more from a systemic perspective, and probably from a city administrative perspective, as to how the smart city might be leveraged to keep costs down, or make the health provision more efficient, and less about, for example, starting from the position of particular vulnerable groups in society and how they could that their participation in the city could be enhanced. So that more bottom-up, that more participatory, that more community-led approach is largely absent in that discourse.
Right. Okay, we got someone from the IT faculty, Ariel, present here as well. So what's your view on smart cities, Ariel?
Well, if you really want to know, it sounds like a buzzword, and I'm not a big fan of buzzwords. So, I guess question one is thanks for everything, for the presentation, by the way, Simon. And so the question one is this really a surprise that this is happening, given how prone we are to fads and following the money? And so smart cities are really seem to be IT focused, and that's where the money is. Cisco came to us 5 years ago wanting to do a smart city thing. It's all about selling us more of their gear, basically. So that's question part one. Part two is in the broader discourse, but particularly the smart city context. Where's the whole climate, energy, emission reduction, particularly from the energy sector, which is my area of interest? Where do you see that figuring? Especially given the fact that there's a kind of a complexity that most of the energy that will, in my view, will be consumed in cities will be produced outside cities.
Thank you very much. Well, jury's out on how surprising these findings are, and I think if you're familiar already with the smart city discourse and papers and so on and practices, then it might not be that surprising. But I think what probably, hopefully, is useful that we've been able to tie the smart city discourse to particular cities as well, and the city networks. And we've done what I hope is quite a rigorous analysis, quantitative, qualitative analysis, which in anything at least helps support what perhaps we already know, and helps also maybe reveal some surprising factors, such as, for example, quite how important in a sense, a global framing of the smart city discourse seems to be, whereby world cities, capital cities, alpha cities are at the center of that smart city movement, and are posited as being lighthouse leaders by virtue of being global cities, and the assumption being that second and third tier cities will then be follower cities. And in the paper we sort of discussed that in the discussion, saying that we need to be a little bit careful about the kind of dynamics, competitive dynamics this could create, which could actually perhaps exclude certain more local narratives around the smart city. So I think probably that there are hopefully some surprise factors.
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that it wasn't useful. I was just where we can take it. Can we remediate now?
Yeah, well, okay, where we can take it, I would say, and this is precisely why I chose the topic of smart sustainable, is that we should perhaps focus on these absences, and actually certain aspects of sustainability and environmental development seem to be edged out, and so, the role for us as academics, but also in trying to create impact with policymakers, will be to say, well, to urge them that this is not all about a system approach and environmental and sustainable development cast in particular ways. There are also other conversations still important, and that's which the smart city should not devalue.
For me, your research also comes with a sort of a warning, I guess. I mean, one of the things you started with discourse, actually saying discourse and the words we use are not neutral. They're actually deeply embedded in the practices we do. So adopting certain words means it might influence the way we do things, not just we as academics, but also people in governance and cities and so on and so forth. So having some critical perspective on the words we adopt, even if it comes with funding, we should be critical towards it. And I think it is the notion of smarter cities. Actually, the brand is actually owned by IBM, and it was introduced after the global financial crisis. Essentially, global tech companies looking for new markets for their ICT technologies, given that businesses weren't buying as much as more, so they focused on cities as a natural next step, and this is where the smart cities branding came from. So having that sort of critical perspective on language and making sure that we not just adopt it uncritically, I think is one of the biggest warnings from your research. Liz, you had a follow-up question?
Yeah. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. It was riveting. Perhaps, like my colleague, I'm not really surprised at the results.
Right. Yeah.
That the smart seems to be aligned with instrumental, with just doing the same things better rather than doing different things. Right. Taking this kind of incremental improvement approach rather than taking a transformative approach. I wonder whether if you've given any thought to how that aligns to the discourse in the country, how much of this is cultural, right. And if it is, how do we go about trying to address this, maybe through SDGs or through being a little bit more, I think, analytical and prescriptive about what might be the next steps in trying to overcome some of these approaches?
But I think your first point, I would actually say that I've come away from this analysis by being struck quite how a palpable dualism of, on one hand you've got this discussion around the instrumental approach, and it's actually retrofitting existing infrastructure and processes and enhancing them in the course of that. But I think that's only part of the story. What really struck us as well is that almost relentless focus on this being really transformative, and this is being quite new and unprecedented, and this is going to truly transform society. And I think these two strands of narrative, they sort of interact, but they never properly get resolved in a sense. So I really perhaps slightly differently. I was struck by the significance of that. Oh, this is entirely transformative, and behind it perhaps even a sort of a philosophical or political project, that this is actually a way of creating a new society or a new city, which I'd be glad. The data as such does not really allow us to filter down to and contextualize it within particular national discourses. I think that would have to be a follow-up project. We didn't have time to filter down to individual corpora and try to see whether we can discern. In fact, one of our reviewers said, couldn't that be something you could also be doing, that looking at comparing 2 or 3 cities and then seeing to which extent they differ, the individual corpora. But I think this is something we would have to, in a sense, extend it a little bit, rather than being able to do with the material we have.
I'm tempted to. There's a question on Zoom. Okay, well, let's do that one first.
The colleague at the back trying to very well.
Thank you very much. I'm just referencing an earlier graph where you had the academic literature, and I noticed that livability and livable cities was very, very low. And we're talking about the language of that gets used. I find it very interesting. Melbourne won the world's most livable city 7,000 times in a row or something. I don't know. And it was used as a promotional tool very, very, very heavily. So it pulls me to the idea of if there's such little academic discourse around what livability is, and so many of those other areas are excluded from a smart city, but Melbourne is also heavily referenced in smart city literature, where do all of these different ideas around what is smart, what is livability, what is sustainable, where do all of these ideas come together? Because they seem to be at polar opposites. And I just find it interesting, I don't know if this is a comment or a question, that Melbourne so heavily promotes its livability, but is also right up the top to becoming a leader in smart cities, which doesn't seem to be connected to livability.
I mean, certainly across time, what we noted is that, and I think the more recent figure doesn't really do it justice because of the scale of the smart city, but actually livability has increased in terms of its exposure within the academic literature. So I think, for example, Copenhagen more recently has restyled its sustainability approach using urban quality and livability as well. So it might actually have, across time, increased a little bit. But yeah, I think in practice, cities use multiple terms to try to develop their strategies. So they would be using both livable and smart, but for some reason, it would seem that smart has the greatest resonance, as reflected ultimately also in the academic literature.
Okay, there are at least 3 other questions in the room.
Right, okay.
Also conscious of time. So why don't we first take Shireen's question on Zoom, and then Darren and Dirk, and maybe we'll take yours together, and then you can respond to the last 2.
Okay, good.
Together. Right.
All right, Shireen firstly says, thank you for a fantastic presentation on such a great project. And she asks, in your observation, how much of the narrative around transformative change is also generic descriptor, and how much of it is about actionable strategy?
I think the transformative change narrative is one which is really projecting into the future. And as such, I think it is more in the realm of envisioning rather than actioning. And perhaps that's also partly how that dualism is to be understood between envisioning, between transformation and the incremental improvement. So recalling the text around transformation, it's really projecting into almost like a utopian future of the smart city as it will be in 50 or 100 years' time.
Okay. Darren, Dirk, please formulate your question.
Yeah, sure. Just more some reflections, just sharing my research into the sharing economy and looking at how, I guess, my work's looked at narratives of change more specifically, and drawing on research from sustainability transitions and urban studies and elsewhere, and just how similar dynamics are at play between different actors in the sharing economy space and the kind of different dynamics of transformation and capture that are happening, looking at this more from an urban politics point of view. But just to point to your comment earlier about the governance side of things being really up there in terms of, where the attention is being paid, and just how that is also really relevant in the sharing economy sector too, because so much of this is really trying to get at how urban governance is being challenged or how urban governance is being transformed, often by private sector interests to push their own particular agenda, and how that's, whether that's through new technology or new so-called participatory planning processes or the use of data and the contentious debates around data and tech sovereignty, data extraction, and just wanted to throw that into the mix as well.
Absolutely, and in a sense, again, in the article at the end, we suggest that this could again be a follow-up project, because what we weren't really able to do is to tie the discourse material to particular actors. And so you could, use a sort of a Martin Heyer type approach to actor discourse analysis to then actually see how this is played out in relation to particular actors participating in the smart city. But remember that we did a text-based analysis, and I think if we wanted to do a more actor-based discourse analysis, you'd probably want to take this down to a particular city, or you might want to take it down to a particular initiative to see what kind of actors come together and what kind of discursive strategies they deploy in order to advance a particular vision of the smart city.
Yeah, just Rob mentioned your background through also political science and governance. So what can be done to almost arrest this onward march of this sort of techno-utopian paradigm that seems to actually exclude much of, sustainability, livability, health, and so on? Is there anything we can still do to not just let the machines take over.
Yeah.
So maybe just to reframe the question, what should be on top of this list according to you? How should we talk about the future city?
Well, I guess I'm going to respond to coming back there. I think, first of all, I think what this perhaps alerts us to is the criticality of discourse, and that it invites us to search out for and to provide more emphasis on alternative narratives. Yeah. And that perhaps a progressive vision would be to inject more radical thinking around the smart city. And that will partly be about critiquing the dominant discourse, but it might also be by developing some alternative scenarios. Rather than sitting back and criticizing the smart city, what about actually trying to occupy the field by offering up some alternative discourses? That's the first part of the answer, and the second part of the answer will be to, actually we need to learn from the smart city materialized, the grounded, spatially visible smart city, and so in a sense look at how that discourse lands within particular contexts, and there I wonder whether perhaps optimistically looking, whether that gives us some openings to see that perhaps as it lands, the smart city gets absorbed within existing political structures and discourses and so on, and might be tamed a little bit, and might be, contested more successfully than through some of these more global discourses.
All right, Simon, thank you very much again for a great talk and a great engaging discussion. I also want to mention that this guy, Dan Schraven, is probably going to come to MSDI as well somewhere next year. I would probably say the brains behind much of the methodology, and that is going into this paper.
Well, I sometimes refer to it as our Dutch factory. We sort of at 5 o'clock in the evening a quick Skype call, and at 7 o'clock in the morning you'd have the results coming in. So
it's exploitation, labor exploitation from Dutch workers.
He's a really great guy, and I hope that he'll be able to make it.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Simon. I think you are available for another half an hour or so if someone wants to have a quick chat, deep dive some of the discussions, or just more generally talk about something with Simon. Feel free to hang around in the room. Thanks everyone for joining us, particularly people from outside of MSDI, Ariel, Leighton from MADA, sorry, I didn't catch your first name. From Swinburne University, and actually Rob Brim will come here as well from Buildings and Properties, which is great. You attract a very diverse audience.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me, and also very much Amy and Donna, thank you for all the support you've given me. It's really much appreciated.
Excellent. Thank you.